Hello everyone, my name's Frank Pietropollo. I want to thank you for joining me today for my presentation. I'm an assistant professor in the biology and chemistry department at the County College of Morris. The County College of Morris, or CCM as you might hear me refer to it, is located in Randolph, New Jersey. I primarily teach anatomy and physiology 1 and 2, lecture and lab, but I also teach pathophysiology, which is typically only offered in the summer, and that class has a lecture-only component to it. I am certified to teach online classes via the training that was offered in-house. There was 3 specific trainings that I went through, and I'm also a Quality Matters certified instructor. Today what I'd like to do is talk to you about feedback and how we can personalize feedback to overall make the educational experience much better for students. So let's get started and take a look at the objectives. We're going to understand the importance of incorporating student and instructor feedback to engage students. So what exactly does this mean? Not only should we be providing regular and timely feedback to students, but we should also be expected to receive feedback from students on a regular basis, not just at the end of the semester in formal reporting, which is typically done. We want to always know what is going on with the students and how we can impact the students and drive up those success rates. So overall feedback will not only help the students, it will help instructors increase their teaching effectiveness, which at the bottom line at the end of the day is being student-centered because we are trying to increase their success and have them to have the best experience possible. We're going to illustrate the various methods that can be used to gather feedback, whether it's written, whether it's oral, whether it's formal, whether it's informal. We have a lot of different things to cover today, and you'll see that I use some things that are paper-based and I use some things that are electronic, and it really needs to be a combination of those things. Feedback, and this is something that I want to be an overall theme of this presentation. Feedback really should be an equitable process when we're looking at it, and what do I mean by that? Well, we want to gather as much research from the students as possible regarding what resources do you need to do well in my course or your course. And if you can use feedback to gather those resources, you can then figure out from the various students in your class, which is typically going to be different semester by semester, but you can gather that feedback and then at least you can offer maybe some of those resources that are suggested by students that you've never run into before. Because there's always emerging technologies. There's always going to be updates. We can't just pretend that we're going to keep teaching the same thing and just keep hitting play each semester with our courses. So that's really important to think about as we move through this. But we will look at those various methods to obtain feedback. One thing I do want to point out, I am using my iPad to screen share onto my computer, so if you see me look down occasionally, that's why. I just want to make sure when I'm drawing arrows or increasing the size of something, I am actually pointing to the right thing. So let's start with what is feedback. Feedback is providing information to a person or group of people based on product or performance. And one thing that you really want to, I would say, try and convey with students and even for yourself when you're providing feedback, it shouldn't be personal, meaning it shouldn't be an attack. You have to figure out how to provide feedback in a helpful fashion because you're going to get much further and get results out of that versus something that comes across very nasty. So first, we are going to look at learner or student feedback versus instructor feedback. Student feedback is going to be when you provide students with feedback so that they can make corrections. So for example, this is going to be they provided you with an assignment and you are going to make corrections because they spelled something wrong or they put an incorrect answer in there. You can also input into assessments when you are providing feedback, potentially resources that students can use. I do this all the time. For example, I'm grading a lab assignment and I notice that a student struggled in the lab assignment, and I say, why don't you go to our tutoring center for self-study where you can actually touch the models and fill out the lab assignment while you're doing that? Or come to my office hours, because students are bombarded with so many things. We know they don't read every email. We know they don't read every announcement. We can say this 10, 15, 20 times, and you'll still get students at the end of the semester that don't know this. So I try and be as redundant as possible, and make sure everybody is aware of that type of information. Regarding instructor feedback, this is going to be things that you're asking students to gauge or provide information on your teaching effectiveness. The course, meaning, is it too much material? Is it too little material? Maybe the resources. How do the students like the publisher resources? How do they like the electronic resources from the publisher? And that way you can really figure out what works and what doesn't work. Now, in regards to feedback to the instructor, this is typically difficult to obtain throughout the semester. Hopefully, students become more and more comfortable with you as you move through the semester. However, there are some ways to hopefully make students comfortable with you early on, and we'll talk about that when we get to introduce yourself discussion board a little later on in this presentation. We have formal versus informal feedback. So there's all these different categories that you really have to be thinking about. Formal feedback is going to be that planned feedback. Again, this is going to be a graded paper, for example, an exam, having your student opinion reports where you have that course evaluation feedback potentially in a semester, weeks 12 through 14, and it has to be rolled out at a very specific time. Informal feedback is going to be the spontaneous feedback that you're going to get. So maybe somebody says in class something that you never thought they would say, but it's a good and valid point that you can implement into the class. Like, as an example, I had somebody a few weeks in my AMP2 laboratory class say to me, I found a really good resource on YouTube where this person on YouTube was able to convey the information about the tissues we were studying, and I made a note in class, these two tissues are commonly mistaken for one another, and I have some good ways to remember it, but the student said, when you're not with us, meaning me as the instructor, I use YouTube, and the person on YouTube, they sent me the video, had some additional ways to remember the tissues versus what I stated in class. So what I did was I posted that as an ungraded resource on my Blackboard course shell, which was excellent, and I got a lot of good feedback after I did that. So something like that that is useful that you can implement is really important because it can help students right away. It's not in those student opinion reports where now you're waiting until next semester or potentially 2 semesters to implement that type of feedback. Next, we're going to talk about positive versus negative feedback. You want to try and use positive feedback as much as possible. The reason for this is because it is supportive. You are trying to be a motivator as the instructor. You are trying to be a coach. And what you're trying to do is show the students you really care. You're trying to show the students, look, here's what you did. Let's take corrective action. Let's learn from the past, and let's not make those mistakes again. And this ties into providing regular feedback. If you keep providing feedback up to an assessment, a high-stakes assessment, at least there was smaller bits of feedback along the way so that the student was able to hopefully take that corrective action. Now, you can't use positive feedback 100% of the time. There's sometimes where there has to be a no, or there has to be a hard correction, and that falls under negative or corrective feedback. What happens is you are trying to tell a person you need to stop doing this now because it is totally incorrect. In Bio 101, which is Anatomy and Physiology 1 lab, there are a few terms that are 1 or 2 letters off, and students often say, why is spelling so important? I think you're being too harsh. And I explained to students, could you imagine you went in for surgery? There's a structure very similarly spelled on the jaw and on your arm. Could you imagine you went in for jaw surgery and a nurse or a doctor spelled because it was one letter and who cares? And you come out and you have surgery on a totally wrong body part? You really wouldn't be too happy. Usually everybody laughs. That breaks the ice, and then they usually understand that I'm not really being harsh. This is a potential liability in the future for my students who are going into nursing, for example. So sometimes this is unavoidable to use this negative feedback, but if you can use it as sparingly as possible, that really is going to be ideal, and combination is really what we want here. 3/4, 80%, 85% positive feedback, and then a little bit of that negative feedback. And here's how I do that. I'll make corrections in Blackboard in the comments section in an actual document. I'll scroll through the document and leave comments for students. And then what I'll do is on the side where there's the overall comments section, I'll say, nice job with this assignment, and whoever's name it is. I always make sure I put whoever's name it is in there because it shows a more personalized touch that they're not just a number, that student. You really are trying to have a conversation with them. And then I'll say, please view the feedback that I left. If you have any questions, please let me know. And then I'll say, here's some resources that could be helpful. Office hours, tutoring center hours, Bio 101 review sessions, all the recorded videos from during the COVID-19 pandemic that are still available. Please utilize all these and let me know if you have any questions. So combination is really important here. Let's talk about feedback for the instructor. You don't want to rely on one method. You want to rely on multiple methods. And the reason for this is we have different types of learners in our class. You could have somebody who's a visual learner versus somebody who is an auditory learner. They might get some form that is sent out by the school that's very generic, and they put all 5s in, or they put all 1s in, and they just go right down the row. So if you implement different types of feedback, that is going to be really helpful in regards to getting successful feedback from different students at different times during the semester. So maybe they're reluctant to do the first whatever mode you use to get feedback, but then the second time when you use a Google form, it's much better for them. Let students have a voice is my next bullet point. Don't automatically say no. Hear students out. I know this takes up a lot of time. I know we're all busy. It takes up a lot of my time too. But what I do is I let students explain themselves. One story comes to mind. I was actually having a review session on Zoom, and I had one student who said, Professor, we have an exam today. Could we push it back? Now, we already had a snow day in that semester, like maybe 2 or 3 days before. So let's say this was a Monday, Wednesday class, and we had a snow day on Monday. We're meeting on Tuesday, and everybody was like, the test was supposed to be Monday. We're having it on Wednesday now, so there's already 2 extra days to study. Now they want it pushed back again. And I let the student go on, and she was saying how there was so much material, and I 100% agree. But then I reminded the students, we already moved the exam back. It's really important not to stray too far from our schedule because this is going to cause issues down the line with the other assessments, and we have a final exam for the class. And I turned it into a motivational talk, a pep talk, and I said, you guys are ready for this. We've had weeks moving up to this exam. We've had multiple review sessions. You guys come to tutoring. We've stayed after class and studied. And turns out everybody did really well when they actually took the exam. The problem was when you get something like that going on in class, now other students start joining in and there's this pack mentality. But when you just say no and shut it down, it makes it look like you don't actually want feedback. So then in the future, the students might not necessarily provide you with feedback. So that's an issue in itself. So by hearing the students out, and then when you do say no, if you could justify why you say no, that's great. That's what you want to do, because I'll be honest, after the exam, as this student was handing it in, she said, can I talk to you real quick? And she said, I apologize for what I did yesterday. She goes, after you explained it, she goes, I really do understand that you have our best interest, and we were ready to take the exam. She goes, I was just trying to get more time. And I really appreciated that, and I said, I appreciate you telling me that. So that was very powerful. Implementation plan. If there is something you can implement in the current semester, by all means do it. If it's something simple, do it. There's some things that we cannot implement in a current semester. Let's say there's something that might be pertaining to every single lecture and you have to update everything. You might want to wait until the next semester. Also, I don't implement any new technologies in a semester. I try to flush out that technology in between semesters and make sure it works correctly before I roll it out for the students to actually use. That's really important because you can run into issues with that. So just keep that in mind when you are implementing new technologies in the class. The other thing that I learned early on in my educational career, you really don't want to try something once and then give up if it doesn't work. So if something doesn't work, look at it objectively. Was it because it wasn't implemented correctly? Is there something you could tweak? Was it a bad class? That's happened before. There was something that was a total disaster when I implemented it. I didn't just give up. I tried the next semester. It was very successful, and I've been doing it ever since. There's a few things that I've done that actually work with, so that could be really important. Last but not least, be honest with yourself. So when I say that, don't take things personally, but take responsibility. If you're reading something and there's a lot of students who are saying your pace is too quick, for example, when you're delivering the lecture. If 2 people state this, okay, maybe it was too quick for them. If 20 out of 24 people state this in a class, maybe you are moving too quickly. Don't take it personally, because maybe every other class you could move at this pace. It's just this particular set of students that needed more time. So this is something that I try to be careful with, the pacing as an example. In all my classes, I say at the end of, say, every section, how's everybody doing? Are we moving at an acceptable pace? Sometimes there's more complex topics where I know I have to slow down, and then there's other less complex topics that I can go much quicker. So something like that, it might even be feedback every few minutes. It might be feedback topic by topic. It might be feedback class by class. You know your class is the best. Use what you see fit there. Feedback for a student. First of all, feedback should be easy to understand. The reason you're actually providing feedback as the instructor is probably because they did something wrong, which means they didn't understand it. If you leave feedback that is complicated to understand, they're already confused, they don't know what they should have known in the first place, they're not going to understand the feedback. So, short, to the point, and always put in there, if you need further explanation, please come talk to me, or go to tutoring if you have tutoring available on your campus, for example. So that's really important. Motivate, but evaluate. Always spin the feedback in a positive way. We want to make sure that students, again, are not put down. We don't want them to stop coming to class. We don't want them to stop using resources. We want them to continue to do what they were doing so that they are successful at the end of the day and they could move on from our class and go into whatever the next class in their major happens to be. Don't nitpick. I've had a few instructors who did this where, depending on the rubric, this could be different, and how you have your rubric set up, for example, or your grading policy. But what I've found is, let's say that there's a particular word that you're grading something and you keep leaving a comment and it's like 11 times. A student opens up that feedback now and they think it's a total disaster. So what you can do is, and I do this now, let's say that there's a word in a lab that I'm grading and they keep getting it wrong. I'll leave a comment next to the first word and I'll say, from this point forward in the paper, everywhere else, I'm not going to leave a comment, but make sure you fix all of your spelling mistakes for this particular body structure. And then you can also, I know this is what I do, I just highlight the other words so that they know every time or wherever else that word is, they know that that's an issue, but I don't keep leaving feedback. So when a student opens it, they don't panic and see all these comments written and the paper's all marked up. Last but not least, and all of these are important on here, but I think this one is especially important, regular and timely feedback. When I say regular, what I mean by that is we want to make sure that we don't have a midterm and a final in class. I know I had this when I was going to school. I know some instructors that still do this, and I'm sure this will continue to go on for a long time. But think about this from a student perspective, because I think sometimes we forget what it's like to be a student. If you just have a midterm and a final, and there's no other feedback throughout the semester, how do you know how you are comprehending the material throughout the class? That is putting a lot of weight on just 2 assessments in the class. So when I say regular feedback, have something due at the end of every academic week. Have low stakes assessments, have quizzes, have resources from the electronic resources from the publisher if possible. I use mastering A&P assignments to check in and see how the students are doing. Use Kahoot in class. There's a lot of different things that you can do. And even with quizzes in an online class, I had some instructors who did this where they made, say, 5 or 6 chapter quizzes due the day the exam was due. Even that is really not too helpful to students because they're not getting that feedback before the exam if they're doing it that same day the exam is due, especially depending on how you have the feedback settings in your learning management system. So that's just something to think about to really benefit students and be student-centered. Timely is also important. You should have a feedback policy that's very clear. My feedback policy is going to vary depending on the course time. So for example, in a 15-week semester, my feedback policy is 7 days. I'm going in a few hours after the deadline and I'm grading my assessments. I don't like my students to wait if they don't have to. And I'm actually too consistent because if I'm a few hours off, this is how consistent I am. If I'm a few hours off, I'll actually get students email me and say, hey, it's not a problem that you didn't grade the lab assignments this week, but you do them every Sunday morning from 6 a.m. to 7 a.m. and I see it's not done yet. Are you okay? So it's actually pretty funny, and it's nice that the students care that much. But timely is important because you just want to stay in your grading policy at grading feedback policy time frame, because you want to just make sure that you're setting the proper example as an instructor. If you want them to turn things on time, don't say you're going to grade something in 7 days and then it's 15 days later and you still haven't graded it. Other modalities or other classes, let's say I was teaching a 5-week semester, my feedback policy might be 3 days. So it could be whatever you define it as or whatever your school wants you to define it as, but just make sure you are staying within those time frames. Formative versus summative feedback. Formative feedback is going to be asking students to complete assignments that typically contain smaller amounts of information, whereas summative feedback is going to ask students to complete assignments that have large amounts of information. Playing off the last bullet point, the formative feedback are going to be things like quizzes or mastering A&P assignments, Kahoots, where summative is going to be unit exams or departmental comprehensive exams. And we want to build up, like I was saying before, with the formative feedback to the summative feedback, because that is going to be the one that is going to impact the student's grade more. We'll come back to this, and I'm going to actually show you how I use Kahoot for both. Written feedback is probably what the majority of us are going to use, and this is what I use most of the time. This is a very formal approach. Things are written down. Students take things more seriously when they have a little grade pop up in their learning management system and there's comments in there, versus oral feedback, which we'll talk about on the next slide. But they both have their places, don't get me wrong with that. Comments for improvement study suggestions. These are all things that I was talking about on some of the prior slides. You can provide an example for spelling. So if you're walking down the hallway with somebody and they ask you how to spell something and you just blurt it out, they're not writing it down. They're not going to remember it a few minutes later. So this is going to be something that, at least if you put down on a learning management system, or even if you're using paper-based assignments and you write something, you cross it out and you write the correct answer, this is something they can refer back to. We want to bridge the gap too from, I would say, the lower levels of Bloom taxonomy to the upper levels, apply, analyze, for example, and you might even put questions when a student writes a wrong answer. In one of my early lab assignments on the tissues for AMP1, there's a scientific method question that I could think about. It's identifying the control variables, and the students almost never get this correct because it's a little more of a difficult concept to think about. But the question I always write back down is, what is the same for all of the participants in the experiment? Because that's what they missed. The question was, what are the control variables? And they didn't understand that. So I write it in a different way, so then at least they can go back and look at a maybe non-scientific question and then answer that. Or I'll sometimes write a question, somebody will make a good point, and I'll apply the anatomy and physiology now to a disease, and I'll ask them a question about that, and hopefully that stimulates some curiosity, and they go out and they research that a little more. But these last 3 bullet points, these are really student-centered tactics, because you, again, are trying to make the experience better for the students, and you're seeing where each individual student is struggling, and it's personalized to that student to try and get them, based on their strengths and weaknesses, to being successful in the course. Oral feedback. This is something I've actually been using more and more. It is less formal, but more powerful potentially. In online classes, I sometimes use this where I'll use a teleconferencing software to record, or we have Panopto available to us. I'll use Panopto, and I'll actually open up the Microsoft Word document, say a student submitted or a PDF, and instead of leaving written feedback, I'll use my mouse with the tracer on it so the students can see, or I'll use my iPad like I'm doing now with the laser pointer, which I can do like this, for example, and I can record that, and I'll say, this word right here, for example, is spelled incorrectly, so you need to fix that. And then I'll go down to the next page. This word right here is spelled incorrectly. You need to fix that, and I'll write it out on the slide for them. So this is pretty cool, and students get that the first time, and I get emails. This is really cool. Thank you so much. This is very, very helpful. And why is it also potentially more powerful? When you leave written feedback, especially in an online course, those students might never, ever meet you. How many times have you taken an email out of context? Somebody doesn't mean anything by it, but you read it incorrectly. Hopefully you cool off a little bit, go back and reread it, and you're like, never mind, I read that incorrectly. That happens with students too. In an online course, and maybe even a hybrid course, they don't know you that well. So if you can talk through something, they hear your pronunciations, they hear your emotions, they know you don't mean it in a negative way, and you're trying to be helpful. In regards to the oral feedback, this next bullet point is more or less the students providing feedback to the instructor, not the other way. We know students are reluctant to talk in class. I know sometimes there's still some meetings I'm reluctant to talk. I'm sure there's some meetings or events you're reluctant to talk still, depending on the venue. But the more time goes on, more than likely the students will become more and more providing you with oral feedback inside the classroom, outside the classroom. Again, next bullet point, inside, outside the classroom. I've had some really good conversations with students during office hours, during tutoring center, in the hallway walking between classes, because again, they are sometimes afraid to say something in front of their peers, which is really a problem, and it's really unfortunate too, but I've had some really good things come out of those conversations. And last but not least, the oral feedback really helps visual learners when I'm scrolling through a document and writing things down and they just don't see text and there's no context there for them to know why maybe that's the wrong answer. And I could explain things a little more, again, with that oral feedback. So that's really important. So now we're going to talk about blogs and discussion boards and how I use this in class. Regarding the blogs and discussion boards, I have what are called your choice blogs, and they're exactly what they sound. This goes with the second bullet point. I'm going to explain it now. The your choice blogs, students are given 3, 4, 5 choices for a particular topic. You choose what you would like to write about. My Chapter 2 Your Choice blogs asks students to write background information on proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. That's the first paragraph. The second paragraph, I ask students, take that information and apply it. Look up some form of a disease, for example, involving proteins, and tell me about it. Students really enjoy this. I've gotten excellent feedback on this. Students like that they can, first of all, pick their own topic, and then disease-wise, there's so many different diseases they can research. Students don't know that they're interested in something, and this leads them down that path of now becoming very interested in something. Some students maybe have a disease, or they have a parent, a sibling, an aunt, an uncle, a friend who has this disease, and they're going to research it, and they share that information about the treatment. So it works out being really well, and all the other students can see this, so very helpful. I also use Ask Your Instructor discussion boards because these are going to benefit the whole class, where they can post a question in there. It's not just to me, it's to all the students, because usually if one student has a question, they all have questions, or a lot of other students have questions on that same topic. The point, though, is going back up to that first bullet point. We know sitting behind a computer or on the other side of a phone, students, even us sometimes, we're more comfortable saying something when somebody's not standing directly in front of us. So this can be very helpful in regards to obtaining feedback in the class. And it really starts on day 1 of the semester. I use an introduce yourself discussion board, face-to-face, hybrid, and online classes. I ask students, write a little paragraph about yourself, please. Talk about maybe your major, what you want to do occupationally, what your interests are, what types of things do you think are going to be an issue in this class, and I get all kinds of different things. But the point is that I make the first post, I talk about my educational background, my interest, and I share a lot of information just to show students that I would like to have a professional relationship, but also I'm willing to speak with the students and interact with the students. And these are instructor-student types of interactions. That's really important to, I would say, get under your belt on day 1 or the first week of the semester during the orientation. You're setting the standard as the instructor. You're showing the students that you shouldn't be posting one sentence for a discussion board. It should be lengthy, because I explained that in my post. This is an example of one that would, for example, get a 100% if this was being graded. And the Introduce Yourself discussion board is a graded component as well. And what happens is, besides that, I will go and I will reply personally to every single student, and I'll pull out personal information so they know that I actually read it, and it shows that I really do care about every single student. And then I tell students that they need to reply to 1 or 2 other students, and what that does is that starts the student-student interactions, and by the time the Your Choice blogs come around and the other discussion boards, and for example Bio 274 pathophysiology with the group project, there's a lot of interaction that takes place, and this really all started with that Introduce Yourself discussion board, which is really, really cool. So more than likely, your learning management system has something built in regarding blogs or discussion boards, and it really helps outside the classroom. And You can also discuss basic concepts on here and do more of a flipped classroom type of environment where maybe you discuss, for example, with me, the anatomy on the discussion board, and then the physiology you discuss more in class where you can actually apply the information. We're going to move into an electronic resource that I use, which is going to be Google Forms. Google Forms are a free resource. They're intuitive. You get about 15 gigabytes of storage, I believe, and they have comparable products to PowerPoint, Microsoft Word, stuff like that. You can have multiple people working on one document at the same time, and it saves it across all devices, which is nice. So it definitely has its place. And you can use this Google Form to do a lot of different things. It's a really powerful tool. You can use it to help schedule events, for example. You put a grid up, and then with the replies coming in, you can coordinate when everybody checked off the dates and times they were available so that maybe there's a common meeting time for everybody. You can use it for polls. And what I did was I actually went away from using qualitative questions to more of quantitative questions so that I can really gauge how people are feeling. You can use it for surveys, for example. And the nice thing about the Google form is it is adaptive. So let's say you have a yes or no question. If somebody answers yes, they can get a totally different set of questions coming up next versus somebody that answers no. So that is a really nice feature of this survey. Let's look at some survey results that I took during an A&P focus session. And you can see on the top, I asked a question at the beginning. And on the bottom, you can see that I asked a question towards the end of the session. And towards the beginning, I'm using a Likert scale here, so the students can really give me a true understanding of how they feel, not a qualitative answer. Yes, no, it's hard. There's a lot of gray area with that. So here, this flushes their true feelings out a little more. And you could see at the beginning, I'm confident in my understanding of this topic. And if you look, you could see that there was disagree and there was neither agree nor disagree. Towards the end of the session, I was able to get a significant amount of the students up into the strongly agree and agree. A few students in neither agree nor disagree. One's pretty evenly distributed, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, and we were able to knock out disagree. So we did our job here, and this is actually illustrating how we are able to use feedback and implement it into, okay, this was a very good session, we're going to run it again next semester because it was effective. If you would like, at the end of the day, you can download the information into Excel. It timestamps, it breaks it down by the question, agree versus disagree, and you can see here I had a few questions that were in this exit poll. So what I like to do is take the Google form link, drop it in a Zoom chat, tell the students to fill it out. You don't have to keep refreshing the page. It'll auto update as each student pops in an answer, and then however many participants there are, I wait until that number, or at least until it gets close, and then I'll say, okay, now we're going to start the session, or okay, now the session is over. So this is a really useful tool, and if you've never given this a try, it's really, really helpful. There's even a lot of YouTube videos that can walk you through this if you want to set up those adaptive type questions. Kahoot is the next thing that I'm going to talk about. I have been using Kahoot for years at this point, probably 10 years at this point. I have the Pro plan. I got locked into a really cheap price, probably my second or third year using it, so I really should upgrade to get some of the newer features, but it works for me. So depending on the paid plans and what you actually buy into, you're going to unlock more and more questions. However, when I use a Kahoot the first time, students are extremely excited no matter what the class is, and let's say I don't use it for a few weeks due to time constraints, the students are hounding me. Where are the Kahoots? We really like this. And if you're not familiar with Kahoot, being a game-based software, students can actually use their phone. You'll pop the questions up on the screen. There is going to be a code. They go to kahoot.it, punch in the code that's on the screen. They put in their names, and it's important down here. I tell students use your first name and then last initial. Like for me, I would write Frank P, so I can use it not only for attendance, but figure out data analytics and compare it to grades later on. But you use your phone, computer, tablet, whatever you have, and you match up the symbols on your phone to the screen, and then after however many seconds I set it up for, the students have a timer counting down to answer that question. And depending on if I'm going to use it for formative or summative feedback, that's going to depend how many questions there will be, or that will dictate how many questions there's going to be in that particular Kahoot. How do I use it exactly? Well, sometimes I'll use Kahoot at the end of class, 2 or 3 questions, and I'll say, okay, here's some topics we went over, and I use it to see, how did you actually understand this material we just covered? Sometimes I'll use it at the beginning of next class and use a little more information in the Kahoot, maybe 5 or 6 questions, to see how students are doing, maybe in a chapter, not just a particular section. Or in lab, before a lab practical or before an exam, I have it where there's 30, 40, 50 questions, and that's more summative, where it's now multiple chapters or multiple labs, and I can see how students are understanding. The instructors get instant feedback because it pops right up the results on the screen, but also the students get instant feedback. They now know, where do you need to go back and study more? Here is going to be a question on the bottom left of Kahoot. You can see that this was a multiple choice question. In the upper right hand corner, you can see that that was going to be a true-false type question. There's puzzles, there's word clouds, there's brainstorm, there's short answer. Again, depending on what type of package you pay for with this Kahoot. But it is really important because there might be some features you don't need, so you don't have to buy into that next package. The Kahoots are great because you can do these live sessions, but you can also email students what's called a challenge, and they could play against the computer, or if other students log in at the same time, they coordinate it with one another. That works as well. Here's some of the feedback that you can get from Kahoot. So it'll tell you by the student's name, it'll go by question and tell you how many students put each answer for the correct or incorrect answers, and you can also look by question type. So here it has the quizzes first, which are the multiple choice, and then true-false questions. Google Forms, just going back to that because I know I did not mention this before, you can do scales in there, you can do short answer, you can do long answer, you can do multiple choice, you can do check all out apply. So both of them have very similar capabilities. As with Google Forms, you can also download a master Excel spreadsheet with all of this data from Kahoot. If you want to use it for attendance, or you want to look back later and link it to, say, exam questions and see if there's a correlation there, and that you do need to have a paid package for that. Moving into formal feedback, again, the last two were more informal. We have SORs, which are going to be a combination of instructor feedback, so your teaching effectiveness, course feedback, did you move too quick, did you move too slow, how are your lecture materials, lab materials, and then resource feedback. For example, textbook, electronic publisher resources. Unfortunately, we know this, because we've said this multiple times, some students are reluctant to tell their instructor how they really feel. They feel that an instructor is going to take it against them personally, or take it out against them personally, and that's not true for so many instructors. I mean, and I hope that's not true for all instructors. But what happens is they wait, and then they write something in the SOR, and you get it next semester, and you say, you know, I really wish this student would have told me, because it could have been addressed in the class, and I didn't want this student to feel this way, like they were left out. And maybe it was a student who wasn't successful because they could have came and talked to you. They didn't know there was resources available. So it is unfortunate. in that regard. So now we have to wait until we can implement that in the next semester, which is a bad thing. And the only way that this can benefit students is if you have a two-part course. So for example, if I have A&P1 and A&P2, now I can implement it in A&P2 and 1 next semester, and hopefully that student is going into A&P2 so they'll benefit. But sometimes we never see students again, so it truly doesn't benefit these students. Feedback across different modalities. You have to figure out what works for you. You have to figure out what doesn't work for you. So online, I'm definitely going to use more oral feedback. Face-to-face, I'm going to use more written feedback. Be sensitive to student needs. Again, especially in different modalities. In an online course, you might get feedback from students saying that they're working a lot or they're struggling with the pacing of the course because they feel like they're on their own. And you really need to know the resources you have available, the resources the publisher has available, the resources your institution has available, and you need to be able to convey that in a way. And you need to set time aside to sit down with these students, and whether that's actually in your office, see if they can come to campus, or do it virtually through Zoom or WebEx or Teams or whatever teleconferencing software you have available to you. But that teleconferencing software, whether you're using it to meet with students or you're using it to provide feedback, is a really invaluable tool. I was an early adopter of it prior to COVID, but of course now everybody uses it, and I think a lot of people are zoomed out and stuff like that, but there are certain applications where it is really impactful to show students you're not just a number. You really are important to me. I really care about you. So you just need to make sure that you do convey that for students. Some time-saving tactics to obtain and provide feedback. Best use of time and space. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel. If you have a learning management system and it allows you to provide feedback, do it there. Do it consistently, though. Don't jump around and leave feedback in the learning management system, the LMS, for one student, and then email feedback to another student. And in regards to this first bullet point, another thing that I do is I know from about 10 years of teaching A&P1 and A&P2 where students struggle in every lab assignment, where they struggle in every, say, lecture, quiz, exam. So when I'm providing feedback, I have for each chapter and I have for each lab Microsoft Word files with comments that I'm typically going to leave. So I use 2 screens, and if you have this capability, it's great. You could do it on one computer, it's just more cumbersome. I'll copy and paste from the Microsoft Word file right into Blackboard, so I don't have to type it out 48 times for a double section of students. That really saves time, and it allows me to then go on and do other tasks and help students in other ways. Last thing on this slide, provide feedback to an entire class or multiple sections at one time. I know this is not always feasible. However, think about it this way. If you start doing feedback or completing feedback, leaving feedback for lab assignments, and there's 24 students, you do 5, you get up, you go have lunch, you come back, you do 5 more, you go out to the store if you're doing it from home, say, or you leave the office for the day and go home, you're really going to be not providing, I would say, objective feedback correctly, because something might annoy you on your way back to the next set of papers that you're grading, and you might now be deducting more or less points depending on, say, your mood or something that happened or an interaction you had. So I always try to at least go section by section at one time, so I am providing very objective feedback and correct feedback, and there's no discrepancies in grade. The worst thing you ever want to hear as an instructor, I mean, there's a bunch of things that I shouldn't say the worst. There's a lot of things that are bad that you hear. You never want to hear a student say, I spoke with so-and-so and you took off 3 points on mine but only 1 point on theirs. You never want that to happen, and I never have that happen because I'm so methodical in the way that I do provide this feedback. So that's just something you would want to think about. So we are at the end of the presentation. I think we're pretty close to about 50 minutes because that was my target to complete this in. I'd be more than happy to discuss anything with you that you might have a question on. If you need information on Google Form, on Kahoot, I'd be happy to provide any information that you would like. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me. My email address is below. You can, or I should say above me, but it's below the bullet point. And you could take a picture of this slide if you'd like. And I believe these slides are also going to be available in regards to being able to watch this on demand. So if you'd like to watch it again, that's fine if you have the capability. But I just want to say thank you so much. I hope you were able to stay to the end of the presentation, and I hope that there were some useful tactics in here that you can implement to your class right now. Thank you, everybody. Take care.